The mistake is not that pain changed you. Of course it changed you. The mistake is what you started admiring in yourself after pain did its work. Not the wound itself, not the loss, not the betrayal, not the season that forced you to become sharper, colder, more careful, more measured. The real danger began when you started confusing control with wisdom. That is where a lot of people quietly ruin their lives. Not when they are broken, not when they are visibly lost, not when they are openly desperate. They ruin their lives when they become impressive, when they become composed, when they become hard to read, when they become difficult to surprise, when they start looking like someone who has learned, someone serious, someone mature, someone who will never be caught off guard again. And because that version of them looks strong, nobody questions it. Sometimes not even they do. But there is a difference between becoming wise and becoming unreachable. There is a difference between learning and locking down. There is a difference between emotional depth and emotional restriction. And many people spend years being praised for a structure that is quietly draining all the life out of them. That structure usually sounds like this. I am just more selective now. I am just more careful now. I do not attach too fast anymore. I do not expect too much anymore. I do not trust words anymore. I do not let things get to me anymore. I do not need much from anyone anymore. That last word matters. Anymore. Because it tells you the whole story. It tells you there was a before when this person felt more, hoped more, expected more, risked more, maybe even trusted too much. Then life corrected them. Hard. So now they speak in the language of reduction. Less trust, less expectation, less openness, less need, less emotional exposure. And because the world often rewards restraint, that reduction starts looking like progress. That is the lie. Not all reduction is progress. Sometimes it is just damage that learned how to speak elegantly. That is the kind of thing people hate hearing when they pride themselves on having become more controlled. But it is true. A person can become more contained and less alive at the same time. A person can become more disciplined and less available to joy at the same time. A person can become much better at avoiding disappointment and much worse at receiving anything beautiful before it is fully guaranteed. That is not balance. That is fear with good posture. And fear with good posture is one of the most socially rewarded forms of dysfunction there is, because it does not scream. It does not beg. It does not collapse in public. It performs. It earns. It solves. It keeps going. It knows how to answer texts carefully. It knows how to stay ambiguous when things get too close. It knows how to pull back before becoming visible. It knows how to act interested without becoming vulnerable. It knows how to leave first, emotionally, before anyone else gets the chance. That person may look stable, but stability is not always what you are looking at. Sometimes you're looking at a highly organized retreat from life. That is the uncomfortable truth. A lot of what people call maturity is not maturity at all. It is strategic numbness, strategic distance, strategic restraint, strategic underinvestment. A system saying, if I never fully arrive, I never fully lose. If I never fully trust, I never fully collapse. If I never fully show what matters, I never hand anyone that kind of power. That strategy can protect you. It can also starve you, and it does both more often than people admit, because the person using it usually sees only one side of the equation. They see how much pain they avoided. They rarely calculate how much life they also lost. That is the hidden cost of becoming too impressed with your own emotional control. You start measuring success only by what did not hurt you. Not by what fully reached you. Not by what expanded you. Not by what made you more human. Only by what failed to wound you. That is a terrible metric for building a life. It is a useful metric for surviving one, not for building one. Let that difference sink in. The traits that make survival easier are not always the traits that make life fuller. Hyper-control helps you survive uncertainty. It does not help you experience trust. Underinvestment helps you survive rejection. It does not help you experience devotion. Emotional distance helps you survive disappointment. It does not help you experience depth. Low expectations help you survive letdown. They do not help you experience joy without suspicion. But if your whole identity becomes attached to not getting hurt, then you stop asking the most important question. Not, is this meaningful? Not, is this alive? Not, Is this true? Only this. Is this safe enough to keep me intact? That sounds reasonable. It even sounds intelligent. Until you realize that a person can remain intact and still slowly disappear. That is the part most people miss. You do not have to be shattered to be absent from your own life. You do not have to be in chaos to be disconnected. You do not have to be making obvious mistakes to be functioning inside a very small emotional range. Some of the most offended people are not visibly miserable. They are just gradually thinning out on the inside. Less astonishment, less trust, less surrender, less play, less warmth, less appetite for risk, even good risk, less tolerance for uncertainty, even when uncertainty is part of anything worth building. And because all of this often arrives dressed as self-respect, it goes mostly unchallenged. That is why this subject matters. Because the problem is not only pain. The problem is what pain teaches you to worship. If pain teaches you to worship control, then every moment of spontaneity will start to feel irresponsible. If pain teaches you to worship detachment, then closeness will feel expensive before it becomes real. If pain teaches you to worship emotional restraint, then openness will feel childish even when it is measured and mature. That is how somebody becomes loyal to a system that no longer serves them. Not because they love suffering, because they now believe control is virtue. And once control becomes virtue, you can justify almost any form of emotional reduction. You can call it standards. You can call it boundaries. You can call it growth. You can call it wisdom. Sometimes it is. But very often, it is just a refusal to be touched by life in ways you cannot fully govern. That refusal gets expensive, not just in romance, everywhere. It gets expensive in ambition, because you start preferring what you can manage over what could transform you. It gets expensive in friendship, because you become easier to admire than to actually know. It gets expensive in work, because you begin to trust exhaustion more than satisfaction. It gets expensive in rest, because you no longer know how to stop without guilt. It gets expensive in self-talk, because you become gentler with everyone else than you are with yourself. And that is another hidden clue. People who worship control are often harshest with themselves in the exact places where life asks them to soften. They can tolerate other people's humanity. Their own is harder to forgive. They can understand someone else needing reassurance. Their own need for reassurance disgusts them. They can appreciate vulnerability in someone they respect. Their own vulnerability makes them feel exposed, reduced, weaker than they can bear. That means the issue is not principle. It is identity. The identity of the one who must remain composed. The one who must remain measured. The one who cannot be caught wanting too much. The one who cannot seem too affected. The one who has already learned better. That phrase, learned better, carries a lot of poison when you are not careful. Because what exactly did you learn better? Did you learn discernment? Or did you simply learn to go emotionally quiet earlier? Did you learn standards? Or did you just become intolerant of uncertainty? Did you learn self-respect? Or did you become allergic to mutual dependence because dependence once came with pain? These distinctions matter. They matter because a person can spend years congratulating themselves for evolution when what actually happened was contraction. They became easier to protect, harder to reach, harder to move, harder to read, harder to surprise, and then they call that depth. No, depth is not the same as emotional opacity. Depth is not the same as being difficult to access. Depth is not the same as saying little and feeling less. A lot of people hide behind understatement because intensity now feels unsafe. That is not always elegance. Sometimes it is defended scarcity. And defended scarcity can become addictive. Why? Because it gives you the illusion of dignity. It makes you feel above the mess, above the needy, above the dramatic, above the ones who still throw themselves in, above the ones who still risk embarrassment, above the ones who still hope. That superiority is seductive, very seductive, especially if your old pain made you feel powerless. Control gives powerless people a private revenge fantasy. I may have been hurt before, but now nobody gets access like that. Now nobody catches me off guard. Now nobody sees that much. Now nobody gets that close unless they earn it beyond doubt. Again, it sounds wise. Again, it may even be partly wise. But wisdom is not supposed to leave you chronically unavailable to life. Wisdom is supposed to make you clearer, not smaller. That is the part people miss. They think because something feels sober, it must be mature. Not necessarily. A funeral is sober. That does not make it the ideal emotional climate for an entire life. And some people live like an emotional funeral without noticing it. Everything measured, everything moderated, everything filtered, everything assessed for risk, everything reduced before it can become powerful. Even joy, especially joy. Because joy is hard to control. Hope is hard to control. Love is hard to control. Trust is hard to control. Creative excitement is hard to control. And if your central value becomes control, then anything alive will begin to look suspect. That is how somebody starts preferring predictability over possibility. Not because predictability fulfills them more. Because possibility asks for a kind of exposure they no longer want to tolerate. So they choose the manageable, the clear, the controlled, the low risk, the emotionally prelowered. And then they wonder why nothing really reaches them anymore. That is the trade. Control gives you structure. But when you over-worship it, it starts charging you presence. It starts charging you range. It starts charging you emotional bandwidth. It starts charging you wonder. And when wonder leaves, life becomes efficient but thin. This is why some very impressive people feel strangely unmoved by their own lives. Nothing is exactly wrong. That is the problem. Nothing is visibly collapsing. Nothing is wildly chaotic. But something is missing. Something has become too moderated, too filtered, too carefully managed to feel fully inhabited. That is what happens when control stops being a tool and becomes the center of your moral identity. You begin to think the highest form of growth is self-containment. The highest form of intelligence is suspicion. The highest form of peace is non-attachment. The highest form of strength is needing almost nothing. That whole framework sounds powerful. It can also quietly rot your emotional world from the inside. Because human life is not built only on staying intact. It is also built on being moved, on being reached, on being affected, on being changed by things you cannot completely master. Take that out, and you may avoid devastation, but you also avoid revelation. You avoid the kind of experience that opens new rooms inside you. You avoid the kind of trust that does not make you stupid, only human. You avoid the kind of commitment that cannot be fully optimized in advance. You avoid the kind of intimacy that asks you to stop performing self-sufficiency long enough to actually be known. And if you avoid all that long enough, you start becoming a curator of your own distance. You get very good at keeping your image clean, your exposure minimal, your needs hidden, your risk moderated, your disappointment manageable. That looks disciplined. It can also be tragic. Because then your whole life becomes a negotiation with uncertainty, not a life, a negotiation. How much can I feel without losing position? How much can I show without losing leverage? How much can I hope without becoming vulnerable? How much can I invest without giving life too much power over me? That is not freedom. That is management. And management is not what the soul was built for. The soul can handle structure. It cannot thrive under permanent internal administration. That is why some people become so good at self-control that they stop knowing where control ends and fear begins. They say they are calm, but they are not calm. They are muted. They say they are detached, but they are not detached. They are defended. They say they are selective, but sometimes they are simply overprotected from surprise. And surprise matters. Not random recklessness, not emotional chaos. Surprise, the willingness to let something become real before you fully know what it will cost. Without that, almost everything meaningful gets strangled too early, which leads to another uncomfortable truth. Some people are not unhappy because life denied them enough. They are unhappy because they denied life entry unless it arrived in forms they could dominate. That is a different problem entirely. It means the issue is no longer only history. It is preference. The preference for what can be controlled. The preference for what does not expose. The preference for what keeps you coherent at all times. The preference for never having to look foolish again. That last part matters more than people think. A lot of control is not about safety. It is about dignity, or rather a distorted idea of dignity. The idea that if you are ever visibly affected, visibly hopeful, visibly touched, visibly invested, you lose standing. You lose authority. You lose composure. You lose the image of someone who has learned better. That is one of the saddest bargains people make with pain. They decide they would rather be less reachable than ever look foolish again. And once that bargain is made, they start calling it wisdom. That is where this version of the script begins, not with the question, "What happened to you?" but with a more dangerous one. What exactly did you start glorifying in yourself after what happened to you? Was it clarity? Or was it reduced appetite? Was it discernment? Or was it withdrawal? Was it maturity? Or was it emotional underliving disguised as mastery? That is the question this entire version is going to keep pressing. Because until you examine what your pain trained you to admire, you will keep protecting structures that look strong but leave you quietly unreachable to the very life you say you want. Once pain teaches you what to glorify, everything changes. Not only how you feel, how you evaluate, how you choose, how you rank what is worthy, how you interpret what is real, how you decide what deserves your respect. And that is where the distortion becomes expensive. Because people do not live only according to what they fear. They live according to what they admire. That matters. If you admire tenderness, you move differently through the world. If you admire courage, you move differently. If you admire truth, you move differently. But if your deepest admiration shifts toward control, emotional restraint, self-sufficiency, unreadability, and strategic distance, then even your healing will start to look like withdrawal with good branding. You will think you are becoming cleaner. In reality, you may be becoming narrower. That narrowing is subtle. It rarely feels like loss in the beginning. It feels like discipline. It feels like refinement. It feels like no longer wasting yourself. It feels like finally having standards. It feels like finally becoming hard to manipulate. And again, some of that is real. The problem is not that control has no value. The problem is what happens when control becomes your highest virtue. Because every highest virtue creates a shadow. If control becomes your highest virtue, then spontaneity starts looking immature. Need starts looking embarrassing. Enthusiasm starts looking naive. Hope starts looking weak. Softness starts looking unserious. Visible investment starts looking dangerous. And before long, you are no longer building a strong inner life. You are building a climate where only the safest emotions are allowed to breathe. That climate feels ordered. It does not feel alive. This is the part many strong people do not want to hear. You can become so obsessed with never being ruled by emotion that you quietly become ruled by the fear of emotion itself. That is not sovereignty. That is phobia disguised as mastery. And because phobia can look elegant when it is well managed, people keep clapping for it. They say, this person has grown. This person is composed. This person has boundaries. This person knows better now. Maybe. Or maybe that person is simply no longer willing to be seen in states that do not preserve image. That is a very different thing. Image matters more than people admit. Not public image only, private image too. The image you have of yourself. The role you maintain in your own eyes. The one who cannot be thrown off balance. The one who keeps perspective. The one who never overreacts. The one who cannot be caught chasing. The one who cannot be caught caring more. The one who cannot be caught giving away too much leverage. That private image becomes addictive because it gives you dignity after humiliation, structure after chaos, superiority after helplessness. You were once hurt in a way that made you feel foolish, exposed, dependent, or replaceable. So now you build a self that cannot be placed there again. That is understandable. It is also dangerous because life is not only asking whether you can avoid humiliation. Life is asking whether you can still remain available to what cannot be fully controlled. And if your answer becomes no, then your life will grow increasingly efficient and increasingly thin. There is a kind of success that deadens people, not because success itself is deadening, because they use success to reinforce a defended self. They become accomplished but not open, recognized but not reached, admired but not nourished, capable but not at ease, and the reason is simple. Their life becomes another instrument of proof. Proof that they are no longer the person who once got hurt like that. Proof that they no longer need. Proof that they no longer lose themselves. Proof that they can function without softness, without surrender, without visible dependence. Proof. 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 When life becomes proof, it stops being experience. It becomes performance for an internal judge. That judge is often quiet. It does not scream. It simply asks questions all day. Did you stay composed? Did you give too much away? Did you reveal too much interest? Did you let this affect you too much? Did you make yourself too available? Did you trust too soon? Did you lower your guard? That is not peace. That is surveillance. And people who live under inner surveillance often mistake their tension for intelligence. They tell themselves they are just perceptive, just realistic, just well-trained by life. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes they are only hyper-alert in polished clothing. The difference is easy to miss from the outside. From the inside, it feels completely different. Real wisdom creates room. Hyperprotection reduces room. Real wisdom lets you respond. Hyperprotection makes you preempt. Real wisdom gives you internal authority. Hyperprotection gives you constant internal checking. So a simple question becomes useful here. Do you feel clearer or just more defended? Do you feel freer or just less reachable? Do you feel wiser or simply more skilled at exiting early? Many people have never asked those questions cleanly because they do not want the answer. The answer may expose that what they call stability has a hidden dependence inside it. Dependence on predictability. Dependence on emotional asymmetry. Dependence on staying less invested than the other side. Dependence on never letting life see too much. That is still dependence, just a more admired kind. This matters especially in relationships. But not only there. In relationships, it becomes obvious. You say you want honesty, but not if honesty asks you to reveal uncertainty. You say you want depth, but not if depth means you might have to say what matters before certainty arrives. You say you want a real bond, but not if a real bond asks you to stop performing detachment as a shield. And if that is your structure, then you may reject exactly what you claim to want, not because it is wrong, but because it threatens the private hierarchy you built after pain. That hierarchy usually places composure above aliveness, control above surprise, dignity above tenderness, self-reliance above shared burden, interpretive distance above direct participation. That whole hierarchy sounds sophisticated. It can also become a prison. And this is where something deeper has to be said. A lot of people do not only worship control because it protects them. They worship control because it allows them to keep their pride. Pain attacks pride in complicated ways, especially pain that involves rejection, abandonment, betrayal, humiliation, invisibility, or replacement. It leaves behind a raw question. How could I have let that happen to me? That question often becomes more unbearable than the original event. Because it is not only about what was done. It is about the image of yourself that broke at the same time. The image of being chosen. The image of being safe. The image of being wanted enough. The image of having understood reality correctly. When that image cracks, people do not only try to heal, they try to become the kind of person who will never again have to feel that kind of collapse in self-image. That is when control starts becoming sacred, because control promises this. If I stay measured enough, no one will ever make me look that foolish again. If I stay detached enough, no one will ever hold that much power again. If I stay selective enough, no one will ever catch me off guard again. It sounds clean. It also means your whole life is now organized around avoiding one specific emotional humiliation. That is too much power to give the past. And yet it happens all the time. People say they want peace. Often what they really want is to never again feel that exact kind of exposed collapse. Those are not the same thing. Peace opens you. Anti-humiliation strategies harden you. Peace creates inner space. Anti-humiliation strategies create internal posture. Peace lets things arrive. Anti-humiliation strategies filter everything before it can matter too much. You can feel the difference. One is alive, the other is defended. One breathes, the other monitors. And the problem with living as an anti-humiliation strategy is that you do not only avoid humiliation, you also avoid reverence. You avoid deep gratitude. You avoid the sacred awkwardness of caring. You avoid the reality that everything worthwhile places part of you outside total control. That is true in love. It is true in art. It is true in friendship. It is true in business. It is true in vocation. It is true in creation. Anything that matters eventually asks you to stand somewhere without complete certainty. If your whole value system is built around never looking foolish again, you will shrink the range of what you are willing to attempt. That reduction will feel like intelligence. Sometimes it is only fear becoming policy. Policy is a useful word here because many people do not merely react from pain. They legislate from it. They write private laws. Do not reveal first. Do not care more. Do not trust words. Do not get excited too early. Do not rely. Do not ask. Do not show too much softness. Do not admit uncertainty. Do not lean in until proof is overwhelming. Some of those rules are useful in certain situations. The issue is not whether they have any value. The issue is when they become permanent law, when they stop serving discernment and start replacing it, when the law becomes more important than reality. That is how a person misses what is in front of them. Not because they are blind, because they are loyal to policy. They no longer evaluate each situation freshly. They run everything through a code built in emergency. That is exhausting. It is exhausting because fresh reality is always more nuanced than old policy. People are nuanced. Opportunities are nuanced. Moments are nuanced. Your own inner state is nuanced. But policy hates nuance. Policy wants consistency, predictability, repeatable rules. And pain loves repeatable rules because repeatable rules create the illusion that future suffering can be managed if you simply become strict enough. The trouble is that life does not reward strictness the way pain promises it will. Strictness may help you avoid some chaos. It may also stop you from entering experiences that require trust before certainty. And nearly all meaningful experiences require exactly that. Not blind trust, not foolish trust, but movement before full guarantee. People who worship control struggle deeply with that, because they only feel safe when value is fully proven in advance. But value is rarely fully proven in advance. So they wait and filter, and assess, and reduce, and maintain position. And by the time something could have become real, they have already sterilized the possibility. Then they tell themselves nothing was there, or it was not strong enough, or it did not move them enough, or it was too simple, or it lacked intensity. Maybe intensity is just what your defended system mistakes for legitimacy. This is a hard truth. People who overvalue control often undervalue what does not force them into a dramatic emotional posture. If something arrives clean, they miss it. If something arrives steady, they question it. If something arrives clear, they become cautious. If something arrives without confusion, they may quietly feel underwhelmed. Why? Because confusion once became associated with emotional seriousness. Difficulty became associated with value. Ambiguity became associated with depth, and so the nervous system starts privileging what activates it, not what nourishes it. That inversion distorts everything. You no longer ask, does this deepen my life? You ask, does this stir enough intensity to feel important? Those are not the same. A storm feels important. That does not make it home. Control-based people often cannot tell the difference for a while. They keep returning to what proves they are alert enough, strong enough, strategic enough. All the while, they are starving for what would actually soften them into a larger life. This is where the admiration problem becomes lethal, because admiration directs attention, attention directs behavior. Behavior shapes destiny. If what you admire most in yourself is your ability to withhold, to maintain leverage, to remain difficult to move, then you will keep investing in the very traits that make full life harder to access. You will keep refining your defenses. You will keep calling it wisdom. You will keep becoming someone impressive at a distance and increasingly lonely up close. Loneliness is not always the absence of people. Sometimes it is the presence of a self that has become inaccessible to genuine contact, a self that knows how to remain intact, but not how to be met, a self that can evaluate everything, but can no longer surrender attention cleanly, a self that can appear powerful, but cannot let comfort land. That is the loneliness of controlled people, not always dramatic, sometimes almost invisible, because they are rarely abandoned in obvious ways. Often, they quietly abandon possible depth before depth asks something from them. Then they call it discernment. Again, sometimes it is discernment. But if it is always discernment, if every pullback is wise, if every closing gesture is healthy, if every refusal is self-respect, if every restraint is maturity, then life somehow always seems to demand the exact same answer from you. That should raise suspicion. When every conclusion keeps protecting the same identity, that identity is probably writing the conclusions. That is how you know admiration has become distortion. You no longer ask what is true. You ask what keeps your private image of yourself intact. And when that happens, even your healing becomes self-serving in a narrow way. You do not heal to become more available to life. You heal to become even harder to hurt. That is a massive difference. The first kind of healing expands you. The second kind only fortifies you. Expansion requires contact. Fortification only requires walls. A lot of people are pursuing fortification while calling it healing. That is why they become calmer on the surface and emptier underneath. They are not becoming more whole. They are becoming more defended against fragmentation. Useful, yes. Sufficient, no. Human beings do not thrive on sufficiency alone. They also need permeability, the ability to be touched without disintegrating, moved without collapsing, softened without becoming foolish. That is what mature strength really looks like. Not total control, not total restraint, not emotional minimalism. Mature strength is not the worship of being untouched. It is the capacity to be touched without losing center. That is very different. And if you have spent years admiring the version of yourself that remains untouched, this new definition may feel almost offensive because it removes your old metric. Your old metric was simple. I am strong because I do not need. I am strong because I do not show. I am strong because I do not get carried away. I am strong because I do not trust too much. I am strong because I always keep some distance. That metric creates one kind of person. A person who is rarely humiliated, also rarely transformed. That is the trade, and most people do not calculate it honestly. They calculate visible pain. They do not calculate invisible barrenness. They calculate avoided disasters. They do not calculate avoided revelations. They calculate what they did not lose. They do not calculate what they never fully received. At some point, if you are serious, you have to ask, what does my admiration for control cost me that no one else can see? That is not a poetic question. It is a life question. It is the kind of question that can expose years of defended living. Years of preferring image over experience. Years of preferring composure over contact. Years of preferring strategic distance over actual depth. And until that question becomes personal, the system stays intact. Because systems do not crumble when they are criticized. They crumble when the person inside them finally sees the bill. So here is the bill in plain language. If you glorify control too much, you may become respected and unreachable, capable and unmoved, clear and unentered, disciplined and quietly dry. You may build a life that protects your pride and weakens your ability to receive. You may call it evolution. But if it keeps making you smaller in the places where life asks for living response, then it is not evolution. It is a defended contraction with excellent manners. That is the center of this part. The problem is not only what pain took from you. The problem is what pain taught you to admire so deeply that you no longer notice how much it is costing you to keep becoming better at it. Once you see that bill, a second question appears. Not what happened to you. Not even what you became because of it. Something harder. What are you still protecting when you insist on staying this controlled? That question matters because a lot of people think they are protecting their peace. Often they are protecting an image. The image of the person who cannot be shaken. Cannot be caught wanting too much. Cannot be caught caring first. Cannot be caught needing reassurance. Cannot be caught without leverage. Cannot be caught emotionally unprepared. That image becomes a private throne, not because it makes you happy, because it makes you feel above humiliation. And once a person starts organizing life around staying above humiliation, almost everything becomes performance management. You are no longer simply living. You are editing yourself in real time. Editing how warm to be, how available to be, how clear to be, how honest to be, how much enthusiasm to reveal, how much uncertainty to admit, how much disappointment to show, how much hope to expose. That editing becomes exhausting, not dramatic, exhausting, because it is constant. And because it is constant, it becomes invisible. You start thinking this is just how adults move through the world. But not all adults live like this. Only the ones who turn self-protection into a moral code. That moral code sounds respectable. Do not give too much away. Do not overinvest. Do not show your hand. Do not need too much. Do not let someone else define your emotional state. Do not become dependent. Do not be easy to move. All of that sounds clean. But clean is not the same as free. That is another distinction many people miss. A controlled person can look free. What you are seeing may actually be compression. They are not free from the old wound. They are compressed around it. They are not free from fear. They are highly arranged in relation to fear. That arrangement becomes the architecture of daily life. It shapes tone, timing, language, appetite, investment, even taste. Especially taste. Because taste is not innocent when identity is injured. People like to imagine their preferences are natural. Their type, their style, their rhythm, their standards. Sometimes yes. Sometimes those preferences are simply defenses with aesthetics. A person says they like mystery. Maybe, or maybe predictability makes them anxious, because clarity demands a fuller response. A person says they like independence. Maybe, or maybe interdependence awakens too much old fear of vulnerability. A person says they lose interest when things become too easy. Maybe, or maybe ease leaves them without the intensity they were trained to confuse with meaning. This is where the subject becomes sharper. What if a large part of what you respect in yourself is not truth, but adaptation? What if your so-called type is partly a survival bias? What if the things you dismiss quickly are not shallow but simply less familiar to your defended system? What if some part of you only feels emotionally convinced when tension is present? That would explain a lot. It would explain why some people are magnetized by what destabilizes them and underwhelmed by what could actually nourish them. It would explain why consistency can feel flat to people whose inner world still expects life to justify itself through pressure. It would explain why someone can say they want peace and quietly prefer activation. Because activation proves they are alert. Peace asks them to trust. And trust is exactly what their private religion of control tries hardest to avoid. This is not just about relationships, though relationships expose it quickly. This is also about ambition. Some people only feel driven when they are proving something. Proving they can outwork the pain, outperform the humiliation, outbuild the rejection, outdiscipline the version of themselves that once felt powerless. From the outside, that looks like hunger. Inside, it may be revenge with excellent productivity. And revenge can build a lot. It can build money, bodies, reputation, competence, influence. But revenge is a terrible architect for peace, because revenge does not know how to stop. It only knows how to outrun old feelings. It only knows how to keep the engine hot enough that the old shame never catches up. That is why some highly driven people cannot rest when they win. Winning was never the point. The point was to stay in motion long enough not to feel small again. That is not ambition in its highest form. That is pain wearing a tailored suit. Again, it may get results, but results do not tell you what spirit built them. That question is deeper. What spirit built your life? Was it curiosity, devotion, love of craft, a desire to contribute, a genuine call? Or was it a disciplined refusal to ever again feel dispensable, foolish, or weak? Because if it was the second, then even your success may be built on a structure that cannot finally satisfy you. This is why so many outwardly capable people remain inwardly unconvinced. They keep achieving, but they do not arrive. They keep proving, but they do not settle. They keep becoming more impressive, but not more at home. Why? Because control can secure position. It cannot manufacture belonging. Not inside yourself, not in life. Belonging comes from a different relationship to experience, not from total surrender, not from reckless exposure. From a willingness to let things affect you without immediately converting effect into threat. That is very different from being out of control. It is actually a higher form of inner strength, but people who worship control usually cannot see it at first. To them, being affected is suspicious. If something gets too deep inside, alarms go off. If someone matters too much, alarms go off. If hope rises too quickly, alarms go off. If the future starts feeling meaningful before guarantees exist, alarms go off. So they shrink it, they dampen it, they reinterpret it. They make it smaller so they can keep standing in the posture they trust most, the posture of the self-contained one. This happens even in very small moments. A compliment arrives. Instead of receiving it, they deflect. An invitation arrives. Instead of letting it warm them, they assess. A good sign appears. Instead of allowing possibility, they lower expectations. A person shows consistency. Instead of softening, they become more cautious. This pattern tells you something. Not necessarily that they lack discernment, that they may be loyal to a structure that equates emotional self-containment with superiority. Superiority matters more here than most people admit. Pain sometimes leaves people not only afraid, it leaves them proud. Proud of how little they need now. Proud of how hard they are to move. Proud of how quickly they can detach. Proud of how difficult they are to impress. Proud of how impossible they are to read. That pride is dangerous because it rewards reduction. It rewards becoming less porous, less moved, less available, less impressionable, less transparent. And because many of those changes are indeed useful in certain contexts, the person rarely notices when usefulness becomes overdevelopment. Overdevelopment is a real problem. A capacity can become too central. A skill can become an identity. A tool can become a worldview. Take emotional restraint. Useful? Absolutely. Necessary sometimes? Without question. But if restraint becomes your organizing principle, then expression begins to feel vulgar. Need begins to feel weak. Clarity begins to feel risky. You start speaking in diluted tones, half signals, half commitments, half presence. Not because you are deceptive, because your system now prefers deniability to reality. Deniability protects the image. If things fail, you can tell yourself you were never really all in. That matters more to some people than they realize. The ability to tell yourself you were never fully in, never fully open, never fully moved, never fully hoping, never fully exposed. That private deniability becomes one of the strongest addictions in defended people. Not a loud addiction. A clean one, an intelligent one, an addiction to not being all the way there. Because if you are not all the way there, then life never gets full access to your vulnerable center, and that feels safe. It also means you never fully know what could have happened if you had actually shown up. Some people can tolerate heartbreak more easily than they can tolerate full exposure. So they would rather lose something half-heartedly than risk discovering what full-hearted living really asks of them. That sounds harsh. It is also true. And it is one reason some people repeat the same emotional geometry for years. Not the same people necessarily. The same geometry. Approach, measure, hold back, signal selectively, protect position, withdraw before full entanglement. Then conclude life keeps confirming the need for caution. That is circular and painful, because the person then takes the result as proof that their system is right, when often the system itself helped produce the exact kind of life it claims to be protecting them from. This is the hardest thing for many defended people to accept. Your strategy may not only be protecting you from pain, it may also be manufacturing the thinness you keep calling realism. If you always arrive with one foot out, life will often feel partial. If you always regulate your visible investment, your experiences will often feel unfinished. If you always keep enough distance to preserve image, you will rarely know the full reality of what a person, a project, or a path could have become. Then you call the world disappointing. Maybe it is. Maybe sometimes it really is. But maybe sometimes you have also become unavailable to what only reveals itself after wholehearted presence. That is not a sentimental claim. It is a structural one. Some forms of truth do not appear to cautious spectators. They appear to committed participants. And if your identity refuses full participation because participation threatens control, then your life will keep confirming a very narrow philosophy. Do not trust too much. Do not care too visibly. Do not hope too openly. Do not stay too exposed. That philosophy protects dignity in one sense. It also limits revelation, which means your world becomes safer and less surprising. Safer and less nourishing. Safer and less alive. At first, that seems worth it, especially if the old pain was severe. But over time, the calculation changes. Over time, you begin to feel the cost. Not always as sadness, sometimes as dullness, as understimulation in good situations, as overanalysis in moments that asked for directness, as difficulty resting into something that is not dramatic, as inability to let joy remain uncomplicated, as a low-grade suspicion even when no threat is present. That low-grade suspicion is often the true signature of control worship. Not panic. Suspicion, not chaos. Contraction, not collapse. Chronic management. And chronic management does something terrible to the inner life. It converts everything into risk processing. Even beauty, even affection, even praise, even possibility. Nothing is allowed to remain innocent for long. It all has to pass inspection. Will this cost me? Will this make me look foolish? Will this put me in a weaker position? Will this ask something from me I cannot fully control? That kind of life may protect status. It does not create depth. Depth requires encounter. Encounter requires permeability. Permeability requires you to stop worshiping the image of the untouchable self. That image is expensive, very expensive, because eventually it asks you to give up too much in exchange for staying emotionally undefeated. And a life spent trying to remain emotionally undefeated is often a life lived in retreat from its own richest possibilities. This is why some people become strangely contemptuous of softness. Softness threatens the throne. Softness suggests another form of power exists. A power not based on withholding, not based on staying one step back, not based on strategic underexposure. A power based on grounded openness. That kind of power is almost invisible to someone still in love with control, because control performs certainty. Grounded openness tolerates not having certainty yet. Control protects image. Grounded openness protects center without needing image management. Control stays above. Grounded openness stays present. And for the person whose self-respect got rebuilt around staying above, presence can feel humiliating. That is why the issue is not technique. It is reverence. What do you revere now? Control? Distance? Immunity? Unreadability? Or truth, contact, reality, and a stronger center that can afford to be moved? That is the dividing line. And until that line becomes clear, people will keep polishing defenses and calling the polished version growth. So here is the central movement of this part. You are not only dealing with fear, you are dealing with admiration. And admiration is more powerful than fear in the long run, because fear warns, but admiration directs. If your pain taught you to admire emotional control above all else, then you will keep becoming better at the very thing that may be making your life less reachable, less surprising, and less alive. So the final question is not whether control helped you. It probably did. The final question is whether you still want to worship what once protected you. That is different, because something can protect you and still become too important. Something can help you recover and still become too central to your identity. Something can save your dignity in one season and quietly start draining your life in the next. This is what happens when control becomes sacred. You stop using it. You start serving it. And once you start serving it, the whole structure of your life shifts. You no longer ask, what is true here? You ask, what keeps me least exposed here? You no longer ask, what expands me? You ask, what preserves my position? You no longer ask, what kind of life do I actually want? You ask, what kind of life keeps me least vulnerable to collapse, embarrassment, uncertainty, and emotional asymmetry? That orientation does something subtle but severe. It changes the purpose of your existence. Life stops being a field of encounter. It becomes a system of avoidance with high standards, and the person living inside that system often thinks they are finally safe. But what they have actually built is a life that can defend itself better than it can receive itself. That sentence matters. A life that can defend itself better than it can receive itself. That is one of the deepest costs of overdeveloped control. You become extraordinarily skilled at filtering, poorly trained at receiving. You know how to assess. You do not know how to settle. You know how to leave before anything gets too expensive. You do not know how to stay long enough for something real to fully arrive. You know how to prevent disappointment. You do not know how to tolerate unguaranteed joy. And because prevention looks intelligent, you get rewarded for it. Other people may even admire it. They may say you are solid, measured, impossible to manipulate, hard to fool, hard to move. And for a while, that feels good. It feels like a reversal of everything pain once took from you. No longer exposed, no longer obvious, no longer easy to wound. But eventually another truth begins to whisper. Maybe I am no longer easy to wound, but I am also no longer easy to warm. Maybe I am no longer easy to deceive, but I am also no longer easy to reach. Maybe I am no longer easy to destabilize, but But I am also no longer easy to nourish. That is when the structure starts becoming visible. Not because it suddenly breaks, because it finally feels too expensive to keep pretending it is wisdom in its highest form. This is where many people stand on a threshold. Not a threshold between weakness and strength. A threshold between defended strength and living strength. Defended strength is impressive. It holds posture. It controls timing. It reveals little. It keeps dignity. It avoids dependency. It can take a lot, but living strength is different. Living strength can be touched without falling apart. It can be clear without becoming rigid. It can need without becoming ashamed. It can rest without feeling reduced. It can hope without turning childish. It can care without feeling strategically defeated. It can be fully present without needing total certainty first. That is a much rarer form of strength, and many people who pride themselves on being strong have never actually developed it. They developed resistance, not the same thing. Resistance is essential in certain seasons. It is not the summit of human maturity. It is one form of power, not the whole of it. You can resist and still be emotionally underdeveloped. You can resist and still be terrified of uncertainty. You can resist and still be governed by image. You can resist and still be trapped in a life built around avoiding humiliation rather than embracing reality. That does not make resistance bad. It makes it incomplete. This is the part that hurts the ego, because the ego loves being able to point to evidence. Look how much I can handle. Look how little I need. Look how composed I stay. Look how difficult I am to affect. Fine. Now ask the harder question. Look how much I can receive. Look how available I still am to beauty. Look how directly I can live without over-editing myself. Look how honestly I can admit what matters. Look how peacefully I can remain when I care. Look how little deniability I need in order to feel safe in my own skin. That is another order of maturity, not lower. Higher, because it asks for the surrender of a private idol. The idol of being untouchable. The idol of being unreadable. The idol of always remaining one step back. The idol of never looking emotionally foolish again. As long as that idol remains intact, your life will keep orbiting around it. You may call that orbit caution. Discernment, boundaries, experience. Maybe some of it is, but orbit is still orbit. You are still moving around an old center, a center built by pain. And there comes a time when pain does not need to hurt you actively anymore. It only needs to remain your organizing principle. That is enough to keep your life small. That is enough to keep your choices filtered. That is enough to keep your future shaped by old loyalties you no longer notice. This is why some people can look so advanced and still feel unfinished. Their pain no longer dominates them emotionally. It dominates them philosophically. It decides what gets respect, what gets suspicion, what feels cheap, what feels serious, what counts as meaningful, what counts as safe enough to enter, what counts as too much to risk. That philosophical dominance is harder to catch because it sounds intelligent. It arrives as worldview, as taste, as principle. As standards, not as obvious fear. But what if some of your most defended standards are not signs of greater truth, only signs of greater adaptation? What if some of what you call your nature is actually a style of injury management? What if your strongest convictions are partially built from old self-protective reverence, rather than present clarity? That possibility is not an insult. It is an invitation. An invitation to become more honest than your image allows. And honesty is what control worship resists most deeply. Because honesty may require statements like these. I do not only value calm. Sometimes I hide behind it. I do not only have standards. Sometimes I use them to avoid uncertainty. I do not only respect myself. Sometimes I protect pride more than truth. I do not only avoid nonsense. Sometimes I avoid vulnerability that might actually deepen my life. I do not only want peace. Sometimes I want emotional invincibility and call it peace. Those are serious statements, not decorative ones. They cut through performance. They remove the flattering language around defended habits. And that is what has to happen if a person is ever going to stop living in service of control. Because control never loses power through insight alone. It loses power when the person finally sees that what they called strength has also become a tax on aliveness, a tax on affection, a tax on spontaneity, a tax on trust, a tax on rest, a tax on directness, a tax on being fully here. That tax is not always obvious in one dramatic moment. It accumulates in all the almosts, almost saying what mattered, almost leaning in, almost receiving the compliment, almost letting the joy stay simple, almost trusting what looked clean, almost believing this time might not have to repeat the old shape, almost entering the life that was there. Almost. That is the landscape over-controlled people often live in. Not tragedy, not collapse, almost life. And almost life can go on for years because it is not broken enough to provoke rebellion. It is only thin enough to leave a person vaguely hungry in ways they cannot always name. That hunger gets misread all the time. People think they need more intensity, more chemistry, more discipline, more clarity from others, more proof. Sometimes what they need is less internal management, less worship of composure, less addiction to staying invulnerable, less reverence for the image of the self-contained one. This is where the future opens or closes. If you keep admiring control above all, then the rest of your life will likely become a refined extension of your old defenses. Maybe more successful, maybe more elegant, maybe more respected, but still shaped by the same altar, still orbiting the same God, the God of not being caught without armor. If that God remains central, then almost every important area of life will keep bending in its direction. Love will bend around leverage. Friendship will bend around emotional caution. Work will bend around overproof. Rest will bend around earned exhaustion. Self-talk will bend around disciplined hardness. And all of it will feel coherent. That is the danger, not incoherence. Coherence in service of the wrong thing. A person can build a very coherent life around a wounded center. That life may even look admirable. But if the center is still organized around staying untouchable, then admiration will not save it from spiritual narrowness. So what does it mean to stop worshiping control? It does not mean becoming careless. It does not mean becoming porous to everyone. It does not mean abandoning discernment. It does not mean glorifying emotional chaos. It means demoting control from God to tool. That is all. A powerful all. Let control serve clarity, not identity. Let control help timing, not replace truth. Let control support boundaries, not become a permanent replacement for contact. Let control steady you, not define you. Once control is demoted from God to tool, a different kind of life becomes possible. You can still be discerning, but not frozen. You can still be careful, but not withheld by default. You can still be self-respecting, but not allergic to need. You can still be strong, but no longer committed to the theater of invulnerability. That theater costs too much. It costs too much because it keeps you performing a version of strength that was useful in one chapter and suffocating in another. You do not have to hate that version of yourself. You do not have to mock it. You do not have to collapse it with contempt. It deserves something better than contempt. It deserves thanks, and then a reduction of power. That version kept you from shattering. Good. Now it does not get to define your whole life. That is maturity, not worship, not denial, not romantic revenge against your softer self. Maturity says this: I know why I became this controlled. I know what it protected. I know why I learned to admire it. I know why I trusted it, and I also know it cannot remain the highest thing in me. That is the sentence that changes everything. It cannot remain the highest thing in me. Because what should be highest is not control, not image, not leverage, not unreadability. What should be highest is truth, reality, a center strong enough to remain open without collapsing, a dignity that does not need constant emotional distance to feel intact, a life broad enough to include uncertainty without treating uncertainty as humiliation. That is living strength, and it is harder to build than restraint. Because restraint can be built through fear. Living strength cannot. Living strength requires a deeper confidence. Not confidence that nothing will hurt. Confidence that being touched is not the same as being destroyed. Confidence that caring does not automatically reduce you. Confidence that needing a little does not erase your dignity. Confidence that full participation in life is worth more than endless protection from embarrassment. That confidence is what over-controlled people are often missing. Not discipline, not composure, not ability. Confidence, the kind that does not need permanent emotional elevation over the world. The kind that can come down from the throne and still remain whole. This is the final movement of the English version. Not pain changed you, that is obvious. The deeper issue is that pain may have taught you to glorify control so much that you started mistaking managed distance for wisdom, reduced openness for maturity, and emotional invulnerability for self-respect. That is the trap, and the way out is not becoming weaker. It is becoming truer. Truer about what control gave you. Truer about what it took. Truer about the difference between surviving with posture and actually living with presence. If you can see that difference now, then the central question is no longer whether you are strong. You already proved that. The real question is whether the strength you admire most in yourself is still serving life, or whether it has quietly turned into a well-respected prison. And if that question lands, then this was never mainly about fear. It was about reverence, about what your pain trained you to place on the throne. If control is still sitting there, then your life will keep kneeling to it. If truth takes that place instead, something else becomes possible. Not perfect safety, not guaranteed peace. Something better. A life that is no longer built around never looking foolish again. A life that can risk being real. A life that does not confuse emotional reduction with greatness. A life where strength is no longer measured by how little gets in, but by how fully you can stay present without abandoning yourself. That is not a smaller kind of power. It is the first kind that is actually big enough for a real life,